Hi, good morning, everybody. We're pleased to have our keynote address with Maury Cohen on broad ownership and sustainability. He has his book here, The Future of Consumer Society, with a picture of a market. Reminds me of a farmer's market here, but also in Paris for some reason with the colors. Maury Cohen is a professor of sustainability at the New Jersey Institute of Technology. He's also a director of the program in Science, Technology, and Society. And he has many other titles and accolades as well. He works with the Rutgers Global Affairs. He is an associate fellow at the TELUS Institute. The list goes longer. He's also developed SCORI, which is a network of researchers, practitioners, public policy folks. So he really has reached out far in terms of understanding and studying and having sustainability reach out further. His book is an example of this. He's a bit of a visionary in terms of looking at current trends, but looking to the future and applying systems thinking in terms of really looking not just at the consumer and the marketing, which I think is where his work started off with, but looking at the broader, also social, human, economic components of sustainability. And he's going to focus more, perhaps under the influence of this group, on the human aspect. So really look forward to his overall presentation of the book. And then we'll have three discussants who are going to focus each on a different part of the book. Then Sally Sledge and myself are going to continue to make some broader comments. So thank you very much, Maury.
Well, thank you very much. Just bear with me here for a second while I get myself a little bit set up. And so first of all, thanks very much for that very gracious and kind introduction. Special thanks also to Joseph for creating some time to give me an opportunity to speak about this book. Joseph and I have been sort of speaking privately for a long time, a number of years, about some of the issues that are highlighted in this book, and so the opportunity to bring that conversation to a wider and larger group is a much appreciated occasion for me. Let me also say a couple of other things about the book, The Future of Consumer Society, Prospects for Sustainability in the New Economy. This is actually the first opportunity I've had to sort of step out post-production to talk about the book. It was just published 5 or 6 weeks ago in the UK, and given the logistics of distributing books in the contemporary age, it just became available a few days ago here in the US. And so there's a scarcity value that the book has, because the copies of the book have not yet really begun to flow through the distribution chain. I received a couple of copies from the publisher a few weeks ago and distributed those outward. Gave the last copy that I had to my sister over the holiday New Year period. And so even I don't even have a copy of the book in my own possession at the moment. So there may be some financially attractive arbitrage opportunities that you can take advantage of. There are 3 books that Beth has outside that can be potentially turned over for a useful profit. So this is the last day of this session, of this workshop, and so I suppose many of you, like me, by the 3rd day of an event like this, I'm pretty fried. And so I'm going to try to keep my comments as brief as I can here today, give the panel an opportunity to respond, and then hopefully have enough time to turn things over to all of you for a really fruitful and fulsome discussion. So to begin, I think there's an inevitable paradox that I have to address. At Joseph's invitation and graciousness, I've had an opportunity to participate in the last couple of Kelso workshops and to gain what I think is a pretty good feel and appreciation for this community. And it's clear that this is a research and community of policy practice that's very much anchored on the production side of the economy. More specifically, and you don't need me to tell you this, on work and workers and how that can be organized in better ways than it presently is, at least within the mainstream. But as a kind of outsider to this community, I've been quite struck by the rather narrow conception of the social experience that seems to run through this community. I realize that people don't work, or many people don't work 9-to-5 lives any longer, but there's a distinct impression that I take away is that the life experience of workers tends to end at 5 o'clock. And again, I realize that many people don't work 9-to-5 lives any longer, but what I find curious is that there's a lack of conceptualizing the life experience, the social experience of people, beyond the workplace, and a failure to fully recognize that people are also mothers and fathers and wives and husbands and soccer coaches and volunteer firemen, and people do all sorts of other things with their lives and with their time outside of the workplace. And so what I'm going to try to do here today, and what the book also does, is to try to create a more holistic impression of what we might think of as worker consumers. And if we're going to talk about consumption and consumers, and as I do here and as I do in the book, the role of consumer society as a system of social organization, it's useful to conceptualize production-consumption systems in broad and expansive terms. And to also recognize, because I come out of a tradition of scholarship organized around sustainability science and sustainability studies, that production consumption systems also have biophysical implications. And the production consumption systems that are most prominent in my mental conceptualization are organized around housing. They're organized around household energy. They're organized around agro-food systems. And they're organized around what we can conceive of as mobility services, or transportation in the more conventional term. And then, as I mentioned a minute ago, that these consumption production systems also have ecological implications. They have ecological footprints, and we need to be cognizant of them as well. So I got involved about 20 years ago, sort of mid-1990s, in developing this issue area, this research domain, that's come to be referred to as the field of sustainable consumption research and policy. I was living in the UK at the time. I received one of the first allocations of public research money for a project on sustainable consumption. That led to a book in collaboration with a colleague by the name of Joseph Murphy, called Exploring Sustainable Consumption, Environmental Policy, and the Social Sciences. And this was really one of the first attempts to look through a truly interdisciplinary social scientific lens at consumption practices and their relationship to environmental policy making as it was conceived at the time. So just a couple of critical caveats when we talk about sustainable consumption. First point is that sustainable consumption is not about green consumerism. It's not about buying nominally green products that we see on an everyday basis up and down the aisles of the supermarket. It's also not about, or it's not solely about, efficiency improvements or efficiency gains. In environmental and ecological and sustainability circles, we've long recognized that efficiency improvements in and of themselves have a perverse tendency to increase rather than to decrease aggregate energy and material throughputs. Something that was recognized as early as the mid-19th century, referred to today as Jevons paradox. And also, sustainable consumption is not about how we can go about achieving relative decoupling of resource utilization from economic growth. It's more radical than those more mainstream, more widespread understandings of how we can manage to engineer ourselves a more sustainable future. It's about how we can achieve absolute reductions or absolute decoupling in energy and materials utilization. And in this sense, the field of sustainable consumption research begins to back up quite closely on ongoing interest in the notion of post-growth, as well as in the idea of degrowth, a concept that's received quite a bit of attention in European environmental policy, sustainability policy advocacy circles over the last decade. So sustainable consumption, or sometimes what's referred to as sustainable consumption and production, has had for the past 20 years a quite prominent role within circles of global environmental policy making, global environmental politics. It first landed on the global agenda. For those of you old enough to remember, back to 1992, there was a seminal conference organized under the auspices of the United Nations, called the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, held in Rio de Janeiro. It gave rise to a significant document called Agenda 21, and when you begin to burrow into Agenda 21, you find in one of those chapters significant attention devoted to the notion of sustainable consumption, and that chapter in part says, all countries should strive to promote sustainable consumption patterns. Developed countries should take the lead in achieving sustainable consumption. And so this emphasis on consumption and the role of consumers in advancing a sustainability agenda has been with us now for 2 decades. It was written into the Paris Climate Agreement, agreed last year, and the specific language went along these lines: sustainable lifestyles and sustainable patterns of consumption and production, with developed country parties taking the lead, play an important role in addressing climate change. And then finally, just to give you another touchstone on the role of this notion of sustainable consumption at the global level, that last year the United Nations adopted what are known as Sustainable Development Goals, and one of those goals is devoted to, if not explicitly sustainable consumption, to the idea of responsible consumption. A number of countries have begun to develop national sustainable consumption plans to, one slide behind. Two countries that have been prominent in this regard, Sweden and Germany. We could also add France, Switzerland, and even most recently Chile has developed a national sustainable consumption plan. And then just to round out the picture a little bit further, we need to fully recognize that there's a tremendous amount of social movement activity, social innovation occurring at the grassroots level as communities, individuals seek to create consumption practices, consumption patterns, consumption systems that are significantly less reliant on large-scale energy and material throughputs. So that's sort of a brief background on what sort of brought me, or what sort of carried me to the point at which I sort of embarked a couple of years ago on the process of writing this book. So let me kind of thrust myself now into some of the more explicit content that the book discusses. So an important point of departure for this volume is the changing fortunes of the middle class. That in the period following the Depression and continuing on through the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, we experienced in the United States, as well as in quite a number of the United States' peer countries, very significant increase in the size and robustness of middle class. And that the fortunes of the middle class and the size and scope of the middle class began to decline precipitously beginning in the early 1980s. And this is a social phenomenon that no doubt everyone in the room here is distinctly familiar with. And so recognizing that the middle class has experienced a couple of decades of rather tough times, I pose the question, and I seek to answer the question in the book, is can consumer society persist in the face of a shrinking middle class? In an effort to begin to get a handle on that question, I identify 5 primary reasons that I see as evidence of a faltering consumer society. And this requires looking beyond the advertising and the marketing and the product promotionalism, that is so much a part of our everyday lives, almost an inescapable part of our everyday lives. But that's really the sort of shiny surface of a consumer society. And that if we really want to understand the macro structural underpinnings of what has been responsible for first creating and then subsequently reproducing consumerist lifestyles, we need to dig quite a bit deeper. And the factors that emerge from this digger deeping include the following. So first of all, there's the issue of demographic aging in the United States and elsewhere, that consumer society developed in its most salient form in the decades following World War II, and has tracked very closely the life course of the baby boom generation born in the years following World War II, as that population cohort continues to age, and as its acquisitive and materialistic propensities continue to change, that it's having significant implications for material throughput. Second factor, and there's been endless conversation about this, as there well should be, in this workshop over the last couple of days, increasing income inequality that is creating circumstances, and I'll talk a little about this in further detail in a moment, creating circumstances in which sizable portions of the population are financially losing their capacity to participate as consumers in the customary and conventional sense. Third factor, and again, this is at the heart and center, I think, of this research community, is the growing demise or decline of wage-based employment, and the fact that large numbers of people are now subjected to much more volatile, uncertain income streams that then make it much more difficult to plan large-scale purchases, particularly for big-ticket items like homes and cars, which really sit at the center of consumerist lifestyles. A fourth factor is inadequate public investment. This is a feature of neoliberalism, most explicitly during the period since the 1980s. We need to recognize that private consumption by individuals and households sits on a base of public investment, and that your car, for instance, is only as valuable as the quality of the roads that it drives on. And as the public infrastructure has deteriorated, that's had implications for individual and household level consumption. And then finally, I've been struck by the fact that this is not an issue that has really risen to the surface, at least from my perspective within this research community, is a set of changing values, norms, mores, lifestyle preferences on the part of the millennial generation. We're seeing this today in terms of declining interest and capacity on the part of millennials to buy homes. That's now beginning to show up in the point was raised in the earlier session about declining home ownership rates in the UK. We're also seeing that in the United States, as well as the social and cultural centrality of a home in people's conception of their understanding of a good life. We also see this with respect to cars. Transportation planners, transportation policymakers are now engaged in a very extensive debate about whether we've reached the moment in time that some have referred to as peak car. And this phenomenon is most notably recognizable on the part of members of the millennial generation. Those of you who have teenage children or post-teenage children have probably noted that your kids have little or no interest in cars. If you turn the clock back 20 or 30 years ago, it was common to see teenagers rolled up underneath the underside of their cars, learning about the machinery, changing the oil, doing simple fixes. You'd be hard-pressed traveling around the suburbs of New Jersey on Saturday morning to find a 17-year-old, tinkering with his car. Just that energy and that enthusiasm is devoted to, their mobile devices, and that emotional energy, that fixation, has very much been transferred from cars to electronic devices. So the book covers a fair amount of ground, and it seeks to highlight and profile a series of strategies that have been talked about at considerable length as offering the promise of a more sustainable future, or of creating the context to enable people to consume more sustainably. Probably most prominent of those strategies is the emphasis that we hear so much about around this, around the sharing economy, which, at least from my perspective, there's painfully little sharing that actually goes on within mainstream conceptions of the sharing economy, but there are facets of the sharing economy that deserve attention and are significant from a sustainability standpoint. The book also has a chapter on the maker movement. This is sort of social mobilization, active expression of interest on the part of growing numbers of people in manufacturing, creating the artifacts of their lives on their own. There are commercial ventures that have been developed around what are known as tech shops. There's the MIT experiment to create a fab lab or a fabrication laboratory. The term prosumption was originally coined by Alvin Toffler back in the 1970s. Those who are familiar with his work may recall enthusiasm that existed at the time around the conflation and co-development of production and consumption, and the application of this notion of prosumption, something that's been picked up very extensively by the sociologist George Ritzer in recent years. And then also the book takes up the case or the issue of economic localization, economic relocalization. The tremendous amount of enthusiasm that has been literally poured into to local beer and local food and farmers markets, I suppose many of you have probably found yourself over cocktails or in backyard barbecues, arguing endlessly about the authenticity of particularly locally ascribed products and making distinctions between local and hyper-local, and this has become a feature of our consumerist lives. It's a little bit more dubious as to the degree to which relocalization represents an efficacious sustainability strategy, and the book takes up some of those arguments. But what I'd like to talk about in the time I have remaining here this morning is a chapter that I never even imagined or anticipated writing when I began this project, but became apparent about 2/3 of the way through, which required me to fundamentally rethink many of the premises of the book. And that's a chapter on the effects of digital automation on provisioning systems. So I'm going to sort of cover in reasonable detail some of the content that appears in the book around digital automation and consumption and provisioning systems. And so just to be clear, when we talk about digital automation, we're focusing here on deployment and innovation taking